according to conspiracy theories and bullshit arguments, which is what I normally see. Does that make sense?
Yep. Absolutely.
I think you have a consensus here.
Yeah, we have a consensus.
Like consensus.
Must be true then.
So let's stop it. So let's sort of look at, let's step back from the question, because a lot of people get very much fixated on the person of Jesus. And what I want to do is step back from the question a little bit and say, okay, let's think about it from the point of view of how did this religion, Christianity, arise? We know when it arose. We know it arose sometime in the early to mid 1st century AD. There are no references to Christians before that. We know roughly where it arose as well. All the evidence indicates the Eastern Mediterranean. So how did it arise? And the first thing we should think about is you can make a strong prima facie case that it arose because there was a historical guy called Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily what happened, but if you look at all of the sources, they all say that there was a historical guy called Jesus. Obviously, the Christian sources all say that. But the very few early non-Christian sources that we have, dating from the very end of the 1st century, mainly from the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and then so on, the Jewish ones, the Roman and Greek ones, they all say that there was a historical person as the center of this, or the beginning of this sect as well. Again, that's a prima facie case, so that doesn't mean that that's what happened. But what it means is that it's pretty easy to sort of say, well, the reason all the sources say this is because that is what happened. This means that anyone who is trying to make a case for another origin has an uphill battle, because what we don't have is any source that says overtly anything else. We don't have a source from any Christian sect that says Jesus only existed in the heavens, never came to earth, and didn't have a historical existence. We don't have that. We have some sources that mythicists try to read that way, and they try to say, well, if you read it with that idea in mind, then you can interpret it that way, and we'll get to at least a couple of those, in a little while. But what we don't have is any source that says that overtly. We also don't have any source that talks about anyone believing that. We don't have any source that talks about, a subsect of Christians or a variant form of Christianity that believed in a purely non-historical, non-earthly, celestial, allegorical, mythic Jesus. So we don't have anyone talking about that at all. We don't have that in any of the pagan sources that we have talking about Christianity. We don't have that in any of the Christian material that is arguing against variant forms of Christianity that existed in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And that's a telling point, because we have a lot of that material. Early Christianity was this wild and woolly thing. There was all various forms of it, and what we have today is descended from the one bit that managed to sort of win the battle for supremacy, and that's what we would call sort of post-Nicene Christianity. And that believed in Jesus as the second person of a Holy Trinity, and they were all God, and Jesus was human in this way and not that way. But there were all these variant forms of early Christianity, and there were lots of books being written both by them and also by the people who were arguing against them. We've mainly got the books written by the people who are arguing against them because they won the argument, so they got to decide whose books got copied. But the interesting thing is, what we don't find in any of those arguments is any evidence at all of a variant form of Christianity that believed in a purely celestial, purely allegorical, purely mythic, non-historical, non-earthly Jesus. And that's weird if that's how Christianity arose. So it's very strange that if that's how Christianity arose, nowhere in this plethora of material do we have anyone even mentioning that, particularly given that early form of Christianity, if it had existed, would have had not just a good claim, a legitimate claim to be the original form of Christianity. Yet no one bothered to counter it. No one bothered to write a response to it. We have responses to the tiniest little sects arguing the most trivial variant on the idea of Jesus proceeding from the Father as opposed to being one in being with the Father. Yet we don't have anything at all about this original form of Christianity that supposedly gave rise to it all. that believed in a non-historical Jesus. All of the Jesuses, all of the forms of Jesus that we find in every piece of evidence that we have from this earliest period of Christianity, all believed in a Jesus who was on earth. Now that goes from one extreme to another. From one extreme, we have the people like the Ebionites, who believed that Jesus was completely human. Didn't seem to believe that he was God at all. Seemed to believe that he was the Jewish Messiah, definitely believed that. But they believed in a purely human Jesus, obviously purely human, historical, and on earth. At the other end of the extreme, we have the docetic forms of Gnosticism, who believed that Jesus wasn't human at all. He was purely spiritual. He only appeared to be human. Docetism comes from a Greek word meaning to appear. He appeared to be human, but he was actually a completely spiritual being who only had the illusion of suffering, of eating, of living like a human being. But they still believed that this docetic, this appearance of Jesus was appeared in historical time on earth. So again, whether you're talking about one extreme or the other, they're still talking about a historical Jesus on earth. All forms of mythicism, and there are many forms, but all forms of mythicism require that there must have been an early form of Christianity that believed in a non-historical Jesus, that it then gave rise to stories about Jesus on earth. It was then forgotten, somehow suppressed. All of the evidence about it was wiped out, and the only bits that are left are the bits that of the Christianity that believed in or came to believe in the historical Jesus. The problem with that is that means the whole of mythicism is based on a supposition. The whole of mythicism is based on the idea that this form of Christianity, this original form, that believed in a non-historical Jesus, did exist, but there's no clear, overt evidence for it. And the problem with an idea based on a supposition is Occam's razor. Occam's razor comes along and says, well, here we have an idea about Christianity's origins based on a human guy. All of the evidence talks about a human guy. Here we got another idea based on this idea of a supposed mythic Jesus form of Christianity. There's no evidence for that. So which one do we believe? And this is why, fundamentally, why most scholars accept that there was a historical guy. Now, the mythicists sort of say, well, there was evidence of this early form of Christianity that believed in a purely mythic Jesus. And as I said, what they're doing is they're taking evidence, taking texts, they're interpreting it with that idea in mind, so with that supposition as their assumption, and saying, if you read it this way, the letters of Paul are talking about a purely celestial Jesus. If you read it this way, then these other texts are talking about a purely celestial Jesus. And there are problems with that interpretation, but the point is, nowhere do we have a text that says, this is how it happened, guys. He was in the heavens, he never came to earth, or he was in the heavens, he got crucified in the heavens, and he went back up to the upper heavens, which is sort of the carrier form of Christianity. It's just that there is no such text. And mythicists have to resort to conspiracy theories to explain why this evidence isn't there. And the problem is, given what I just said, it should be there because we have this massive corpus of apologetic literature that deals with all these variant forms of Christianity, doesn't mention this one at all. The most logical, rational reason that there is no evidence for this form of Christianity is that it didn't fucking exist. All mythicism requires this supposition of a form of Christianity for which there is no evidence.
Yeah, I definitely think you have a good case on that. My question would be, when at certain time did we in previous things say, okay, at this point, the Greek gods, we are going to submit that they were mythological? But even back in the days when the first atheist type of Christians were around that didn't believe the Roman pantheon gods, they were labeled atheists, but they were, some of them might have been saying that these gods are mythological. They do not exist to some degree. So in the historical record in the Greek and Roman, when do we actually see that? And you're arguing that because we do see that in those cases, but we don't see it ever in the Christian case. Is that kind of your argument?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, there were some people, not very many, but there were some people in ancient Greek and Roman culture who did not believe that the pantheon of Greek-Roman gods, that the Olympian gods actually existed, and they just believed that the stories were stories. Most of those guys weren't actually atheists, though. They did believe that there was still some kind of a cosmic divine, but they believed that the stories about the Olympian gods were kind of silly stories. But so yeah, there certainly were people who believed that, who accepted that those things were entirely legendary. But you're right. It's interesting that at no point did anyone sort of say, well, this guy Jesus didn't exist. We don't actually find any of the pagan opponents of Christianity saying, well, what about these guys over here, these fellow Christians of yours, or these Christians who used to exist that we've heard about, who never said Jesus, who said Jesus never came to earth in the first place. So that's another place we would expect to find, perhaps, to find some reference to this proto-Christian mythic form of Christianity, if it had existed. But we don't find that either. And we do have a reasonable amount of material on the arguments that pagans and Jews were using against Christianity, because we have the Christian responses to their arguments. No pagan or Christian critic, as far as we can see, made that comment. So that one's less certain. But the apologetic literature against so-called heresies, that's where we would expect to find this mythic Jesus to at least be hinted at. There's not even a whisper about it. And this is a bit of a sucking black hole at the heart of mythicism, because, as I said, all forms of mythicism require that there must have been this early form of Christianity, and the evidence for it is simply not there. This is why mythicism has to, as I said, go and find evidence for that in texts that everyone else reads as being about a historical Jesus. And so I just wanted to maybe sort of turn to a couple of those. Just before that, though, there was something else that came up in the Twitter exchange this morning, and it's an argument that I see quite regularly. So I might just quickly address that and then sort of move on to some of the arguments that mythicists such as Carrier say are evidence of this mythic proto-Christianity that they need to have in order for their theory to survive. The other argument I want to address, though, is the argument from silence. So there are people who say we have no contemporary references to Jesus, therefore Jesus didn't exist. Right? We should have contemporary references to Jesus, but if you look at all the ancient material that we have dating from his time, there's no references to this guy. Have you guys heard that argument?
Oh yeah, of course.
And there's a couple of prominent proponents of it, one of whom actually popped up in the Twitter feed this morning, a guy called Polkovich. So the argument sort of goes like this: we've got all this material from the ancient world. If there was this guy, he should have been mentioned in some of this material. As an argument against the Jesus of Christianity, so the one who walks on water, rises from the dead, does some other stuff that's pretty remarkable. And it's not a bad argument. You'd kind of expect, if there was someone who was doing that kind of stuff, raising other people from the dead, for example, feeding 5,000 people with a picnic basket.
It would get around, right?
You think it would? Yeah, exactly. So it's not a bad argument against the Jesus of Christianity, but it fails pretty badly as an argument against a historical Jesus period. Because if this guy existed and we're all sort of non-believers, so we don't think that he was God, then he was a Jewish preacher. And why would any Roman historian who had very little interest in Jewish affairs at all mention that there was a peasant preaching something to other peasants in the arse end of Galilee? Why would they even be aware that was happening? But why, if they were aware, I don't know why they would be, but if they were aware of it, why would they bother mentioning it? In what context? So when you look at this argument and you look at some of the material that these people say supposedly should have mentioned Jesus, the argument really starts to fall apart, because the way you make an argument from silence is you don't just note that the sources are silent on a particular point. You have to show that they shouldn't be. So if you look at some of the sources that supposedly should have mentioned Jesus, there's a couple that I find particularly amusing. A guy called Silius Italicus, he wrote a poem about the the Punic Wars. This is the wars between Rome and Hannibal.